The first time Allison met the man who would become her next-door neighbor, she had just moved into her quiet little cul-de-sac in suburban Ohio. She was carrying boxes into her new house when she noticed him watching her from the edge of his yard. He didn't wave, didn't smile, just stood there with his hands buried deep in the pockets of his faded flannel shirt. His stare lasted longer than was comfortable, but Allison brushed it off. After all, new places came with strange neighbors, and maybe he was just curious about who moved in. But even as she went inside, she could feel his eyes drilling into the back of her neck. That night, when Allison unpacked in the living room, she noticed movement through the blinds. Across the street, a porch light clicked on, and there he was again, standing with a cigarette glowing in his hand, watching her house. She tried to tell herself she was imagining it, but every time she looked up, his gaze was there, locked onto her windows. Something about the way he stood, still, motionless except for the rise and fall of smoke, made her skin prickle. She decided she wouldn't let paranoia ruin her first night in her new home. She shut the blinds tight, turned up the TV, and tried to drown out the creeping unease that clung to her. The following morning, Allison found something odd on her porch. A single flower, wilted and dark red, like it had been plucked days ago. No vase, no note. Just lying there on the welcome mat. She looked around, but the street was empty except for the man's house. Curtains in his window swayed slightly, as if someone had just pulled them shut. Allison tried to rationalize it, maybe some kid left it there as a joke, maybe it was the wind. Still, she scooped it up with a paper towel and tossed it in the trash. Days turned into a week, and the strange encounters didn't stop. Late at night, Allison would hear footsteps crunching outside on the gravel, too close to her windows. She'd rush to check, but when she peered through the blinds, no one was there, except the faint glow of a cigarette ember in the darkness, a few feet away at the edge of her yard. She never saw him walk up or leave, only the quiet presence of someone watching, always watching. She called her mom to vent about it, but her mom laughed and said she was probably just nervous about living alone for the first time. Allison wanted to believe that too, but her gut screamed otherwise. One night, after another round of footsteps that stopped just below her bedroom window, Allison's fear pushed her to take action. She left her lamp on, picked up her phone, and pretended to call someone loudly, mentioning how her boyfriend was coming over soon. She hoped whoever was out there would hear it and get scared off. For a few minutes, silence followed. Then, from outside the window, she heard something that froze her blood. A whisper, low and drawn out, just one word, liar. Allison's breath caught in her throat. She leapt from her bed and dialed 911 with shaking hands, her heart hammering in her chest. The police arrived within minutes, searching the yard and shining flashlights through the trees. But they found nothing, no footprints, no cigarette butts, nothing at all. When they knocked on her neighbor's door, no one answered, though she could see the faint glow of a TV inside. The officers shrugged, said they couldn't do anything without proof, and left her with the kind of half-hearted reassurance that made her feel more helpless than safe. That night, Allison pushed a chair under her doorknob, armed herself with the heaviest frying pan she owned, and lay awake listening to every creak and groan of the house. But in the quiet darkness, she swore she heard someone breathing just outside her bedroom window, steady, patient, waiting. Allison barely slept that night, drifting in and out of shallow dreams where shadows pressed their faces against her window. When she finally opened her eyes, the morning sun was spilling through the blinds, but instead of feeling relief, her stomach dropped. Propped neatly against her front door was another flower, this time fresh, its stem still damp as though it had been plucked minutes earlier. A sticky note was attached, scrawled in messy handwriting, "You look prettier when you smile." Allison's hands trembled as she held it. That note wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't a prank. Whoever was watching her knew exactly what she looked like inside her own home. She called the police again, but their response was dismissive. Unless she caught someone trespassing or had video evidence, there wasn't much they could do. They recommended she install cameras around her house and suggested it was probably just a local team messing around. Allison wanted to scream at them. No teenager whispered under your window at night. No teenager left notes that specific. But she held her tongue, thanked the officer, and hung up, knowing she was on her own. That afternoon, she drove straight to the hardware store and bought 2 security cameras and a floodlight. The cashier, an older man with a warm smile, asked if she needed help setting them up, but Allison insisted she could manage. The truth was, she didn't want anyone else getting involved, didn't want to explain the situation again and risk sounding crazy. By evening, she had the cameras fixed to her porch and backyard, little red lights glowing like silent protectors. For the first time since moving in, she felt a flicker of control. But that night, the floodlight clicked on around midnight. Allison rushed to the window, heart pounding, and scanned the yard. There was no one in sight. She checked the cameras through her phone app, replaying the footage, and her stomach knotted. Just at the edge of the frame, near the trees, a tall figure lingered. He didn't move, didn't approach the house, just stood there long enough for the motion sensor to trigger. When the floodlight hit, he stepped back into the shadows, and the camera lost him. She replayed the video over and over, but the angle was too dark to make out a face. Still, she knew who it was. The next day, Allison confronted the neighbor directly. She had rehearsed her words in the mirror, but when she finally knocked on his door, her voice faltered. He answered slowly, as though he already knew she'd be there. Up close, he looked even more unsettling, deep creases etched across his face, eyes that didn't blink often enough. She stammered that she'd been seeing someone on her property at night, that she had cameras now, and that if it was him, he needed to stop. He smiled faintly, a strange, almost amused expression. "You shouldn't accuse people without proof," he said softly, before shutting the door in her face. That night, Allison barely touched her dinner. She sat on the couch with every light on, frying pan still within reach, her phone clutched tightly. Around 1 in the morning, the floodlight snapped on again. She held her breath, opened the camera feed, and froze. The man was there, right in her yard this time, standing at the foot of her porch steps. His face tilted upward, staring directly into the camera lens as if he knew she was watching. He raised a hand slowly, deliberately, and waved. Not a friendly wave, but a slow, mocking gesture that made her entire body seize with fear. Allison called 911 again, her voice breaking as she explained that someone was on her property right that second. The dispatcher promised a unit was on the way, but by the time the cruisers pulled up with flashing lights, the yard was empty. The man had vanished without a trace, leaving behind nothing except footprints in the damp soil near the steps. The officers took one look, filed another vague report, and told her to stay vigilant. She wanted to scream at them to stay, to guard her house, but they left as quickly as they came. Later that night, Allison couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, lurking in the darkness, waiting for the perfect moment to get closer. When she checked the footage again, her blood ran cold. On the camera from the backyard, just before the police arrived, he had walked slowly past the lens, his head turned toward the house. As he disappeared into the trees, the faintest sound bled through the microphone, his voice, barely audible but clear enough to chill her to the bone. "See you soon." Allison barely left her house after that night. Even in broad daylight, she couldn't shake the feeling of being observed. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow shifting across the wall made her jump. She tried to convince herself she was imagining things, that maybe fear was twisting her thoughts into monsters, but then the evidence on her cameras proved otherwise. The man wasn't hiding anymore. He was escalating. On the third night after the police came, she woke to the sound of tapping. Not the random creak of a branch against glass, but deliberate, rhythmic tapping, 3 sharp knocks against her bedroom window. She bolted upright, her throat tight, every nerve screaming at her to stay still. Slowly, she reached for her phone and pulled up the camera feed. Her stomach dropped. He wasn't in the yard this time. He was pressed right against the side of her house, half his face visible at the corner of the window frame, smiling. That awful, knowing smile that seemed carved into his skin. Allison choked back a sob as she dialed 911 with shaking hands. By the time the sirens pierced the night, the man had slipped back into the darkness. The police swept the area, again finding nothing but faint footprints in the dirt. One of the younger officers muttered that it was, probably just some homeless guy messing around. Allison wanted to scream. Homeless men didn't stalk one woman, didn't leave notes, didn't whisper under windows. But she bit down on her words because she could already see the disbelief in their faces. The next morning, she decided she couldn't endure this alone. She called her brother, Mark, who lived 2 towns over. She tried to downplay it, but the tremor in her voice gave her away. Within hours, he was on her doorstep, protective and skeptical all at once. "You should have told me sooner," he said, pulling her into a hug. His presence was comforting, but Allison noticed the neighbor across the street watching from his porch again, cigarette glowing like a signal in the gray afternoon. When Mark spotted him and waved casually, the man simply turned and slipped back inside his house. That night, Mark stayed over. He insisted on sleeping on the couch with a baseball bat beside him, while Allison tried to rest upstairs. Around 2 a.m., the floodlight clicked on. Mark was already awake, his eyes fixed on the window. "He's out there," he whispered when Allison crept downstairs. She checked the cameras, and sure enough, the man was back, standing at the edge of the porch like he owned the ground he stood on. Mark stormed outside before Allison could stop him, yelling across the yard. The man didn't run, didn't flinch. He just stood there, smiling in the dark until Mark got close. Then, without a word, he turned and slipped into the tree line, vanishing like smoke. Mark called the police himself, furious, demanding they take the situation seriously. 2 officers arrived, one of them rolling his eyes as though this was a nuisance call. "We'll make a note of it," they said again, shining their flashlights pointlessly across the yard. Allison could tell even Mark's anger wasn't enough to shake their indifference. But later, as they reviewed the camera footage, the pit in her stomach deepened. Just after the man disappeared into the woods, the lens caught something else. A shape near the backyard fence. It wasn't him, but a second figure, shorter, thinner, lingering in the shadows. Allison's voice cracked as she pointed at the screen. "There's another one." The realization hit both of them like ice water. She wasn't just dealing with a neighbor who had gone off the rails. There were at least 2 people watching her house, maybe more. The single red flower, the notes, the whispers, they weren't the work of one deranged man. That night, neither of them slept. Mark sat upright on the couch gripping the bat, and Allison curled on the armchair, too afraid to close her eyes. Every sound outside became unbearable, every gust of wind against the siding, every scrape of tree branches. Just before dawn, when exhaustion pulled Allison into half-sleep, she heard it again. A voice outside the living room window, low and taunting, almost playful. "He told you I'd be here." Mark leapt to his feet, but by the time they pulled the blinds, the street was empty. The only sign anyone had been there was a single smear of dirt on the glass, the shape of a handprint dragged downward as though someone had pressed their palm against the window and slid it slowly down. By sunrise, Allison realized something she hadn't admitted until then: this wasn't going to stop. Calling the police hadn't helped. Cameras hadn't helped. Confronting the neighbor hadn't helped. Whoever they weren't trying to scare her off. They were waiting. Waiting for the right night, the right moment, when fear would make her too weak to fight back. Allison spent the next day in a haze of dread. She barely ate, barely spoke, her thoughts looping back to the handprint on the glass. Mark tried to reassure her, promising he wouldn't leave until this was over, but even his confidence sounded forced now. He was shaken too. She could see it in the way his eyes flicked to the windows every few minutes, in the way he gripped the baseball bat like it was the only thing tethering him to safety. Neither of them mentioned the possibility that the neighbor wasn't working alone. Saying it out loud made it too real, too terrifying. That evening, Mark went outside to smoke on the porch, though he wasn't much of a smoker. Allison watched him through the window, her nerves buzzing like static. "I don't know how you live with this every night," he muttered when he came back inside. She didn't answer. Her eyes kept drifting to the camera feeds glowing on her phone, each one a lifeline. For hours, nothing happened. The street lay quiet, the night thick and heavy. But around midnight, the motion sensor pinged. Allison's phone buzzed in her hand. She opened the feed and nearly dropped it. A figure was crouched in her driveway, head tilted back as if staring straight into the camera. This one wasn't the neighbor, it was someone else. A woman. Her hair hung limp and wild, her face half covered by shadows, but her smile was unmistakable, a stretched, eerie grin that made Allison's skin crawl. She crouched there for nearly a full minute, unmoving, before slowly raising her finger and pressing it against her lips. "Shoo!" Allison stumbled backward, her phone clattering to the floor. "Mark," she gasped. He grabbed the device, his face tightening as he watched. By the time he flung open the front door, the driveway was empty. The cameras caught only the faint rustle of bushes at the edge of the yard. "Two of them," Mark muttered, his voice tight with rage and fear. "There are two of them now." Allison hugged herself, trembling, her mind spinning with questions that had no answers. Why her? Why this house? The next morning, Mark insisted they go to the police station in person. Maybe face to face, with footage in hand, they'd be taken seriously. But when they arrived, the officer at the desk barely glanced at the videos. He said they'd look into it, but without catching someone in the act of breaking in, there wasn't much they could do. "Install brighter lights," he suggested blandly. "Maybe get a dog." Allison wanted to scream at him, shake him until he understood she was being hunted, but Mark pulled her away before she exploded. That night, they didn't turn on the lights. Mark's idea was to keep the house dark, to make it seem like no one was home. Maybe, he said, they could catch the stalkers off guard. Allison wasn't sure about the plan, but she was too exhausted to argue. They sat in the living room, whispering in the dark, the glow of the cameras lighting their faces. Hours passed in tense silence. Then, around 3 a.m., a sound rattled through the quiet, a soft click. The back door. Mark shot to his feet, motioning for Allison to stay put, and crept toward the kitchen. Her heart pounded so hard it felt like it would burst. She pulled up the backyard camera, and her blood ran cold. The neighbor was there, standing just outside the back door, his hand gripping the knob. But what made her throat close in terror was what the camera showed behind him, the woman, crouched low, grinning into the lens again. "Allison, lock the front." Mark hissed, realizing at the same moment she did, they weren't just watching anymore. They were trying to get inside. Allison rushed to the door, fumbling with the deadbolt, when something sharp scraped across the living room window. She froze. A fingernail dragged slowly down the glass, shrieking softly in the silence. Another handprint smeared across it. Mark came barreling back into the room, bat raised, his face pale. "They're circling the house," he whispered. "One's at the back, one's at the side." Allison's breathing grew shallow, every part of her body trembling as the sound of footsteps surrounded the house, moving deliberately, testing doors and windows, searching for a way in. For nearly half an hour, the intruders prowled around, never rushing, never breaking the rhythm of their slow torment. Then, as suddenly as it started, the sound stopped. Silence pressed down heavy and suffocating. Allison checked the cameras, her hands shaking so violently she almost dropped her phone again. Nothing. The yard was empty. The floodlights glared across barren grass. But then one feed flickered. The front porch camera. She tapped it, and her heart lurched. Both figures stood there, side by side, looking directly into the lens. The neighbor and the woman, motionless, smiling with the same unsettling calm. Then, in perfect unison, they raised their hands and knocked, 3 slow, heavy bangs on the door that echoed through the house like a warning. Mark tightened his grip on the bat, whispering, "If they try that door, I'll kill them." Allison clutched his arm, tears burning her eyes. They stayed frozen like that until dawn, the knocks never repeating, the figures never reappearing. But Allison knew it wasn't over. The knocks weren't an attempt to break in. They were a message. By the time the sun finally rose, Allison felt like she had aged years in a single night. She and Mark sat at the kitchen table, faces pale, eyes sunken, as the morning light crept across the floorboards. Neither of them had spoken much since the knocks on the door. Every word felt useless, drowned by the unshakable reality that 2 people, maybe more, were hunting them. Allison's hands shook as she tried to drink coffee, the cup rattling against the saucer. Mark stared out the window, the bat still leaning against his chair. Neither of them said it out loud, but both knew the truth: the stalkers hadn't failed. They had been testing, studying, waiting for the right moment. Mark suggested they leave the house immediately, but Allison's stomach knotted at the thought. Where would they go? What if the stalkers followed them? The idea of being chased in the open, of their car breaking down on some empty road while those figures appeared from the tree line, was somehow worse than being trapped inside. "This is my home, Allison."